we have discovered that the most likely scenario for the assassination to take place, as it appears to have taken place, would have involved Secret Service participation. The indications of Secret Service participation, moreover, appear to be very substantial, indeed even overwhelming. We have found altogether at least 15 indications of Secret Service participation, which, if we subtract several different kinds of factors because they aren't independent events or because they might have been things that happen only occasionally, nevertheless reduced to a statistical model that makes the occurrence of, say, even 8 of these improbable to the extent of occurring only once in 100 million, or if we consider as many as 10, only once in 10 billion. The evidence of Secret Service complicity is therefore overwhelming. It is unreasonable to believe that the Secret Service would have participated in the assassination of the president without some kind of approval from others in positions of authority. The evidence, therefore, for an assassination conspiracy scenario that involves elements of the federal government is very impressive indeed. If I were to suggest how this matter should be pursued from this point, then it would seem altogether appropriate that a special prosecutor ought to be appointed. It is not reasonable to suppose that the government could pursue this investigation. Notice there have been 2 government inquiries, namely the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations inquiry, that have utterly failed to come to grips with the assassination itself. The only way in which it would appear this matter could be resolved would be by a vigorous inquiry carried out by an investigator independent of, influenced by the federal government. Now, I am not a judge and I am not a jury. Determinations of guilt or innocence in a legal sense must be the product of a judicial process. However, if a special prosecutor were to be appointed in this case, it would not be inappropriate for the conduct of individuals such as the following to be subject to review and possible exoneration. And possible exoneration. I have in mind individuals such as the following. Consider Secret Service agent William Greer, the driver of the presidential limousine. You know about Greer. Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman, Greer's assistant. You know about Roy Kellerman. Secret Service agent Winston Lawson. Secret Service agent Lawson was the advance man who planned the motorcade route in association with representatives of the city government. Mr. Charles Harrelson. Charles Harrelson has been identified with the tallest of 3 tramps who were escorted through Dealey Plaza shortly after the assassination, but who were never properly identified or properly booked. He is presently serving a life term for the assassination of a federal judge with a high-powered rifle, a crime strikingly similar to that of the assassination of the president. Charles Harrelson has said that he was involved in killing Kennedy. He has actually said that he killed Kennedy. He subsequently retracted that claim and maintained that when he said it, he had been out of his mind, and that the very fact that he said it was an indication of how far out of his mind he was at the time. But can you imagine anyone at all, claiming to have killed Kennedy if they had not been involved in the assassination? I ask you. Mr. Jack Lawrence. Mr. Jack Lawrence was an expert marksman in the United States Air Force who came to work for a local automobile agency in downtown Dallas shortly before the assassination. It was the same automobile agency that provided the vehicles for the presidential motorcade. Immediately after the assassination, he showed up back on the lot. He was sweating profusely, he was all muddy, and he was extremely nauseated and vomiting. He disappeared 2 days later. Mr. Chauncey Holt. Mr. Chauncey Holt has identified himself as the 3rd of the 3 tramps who escorted through Dealey Plaza. Chauncey Holt has stated that he was a counterfeiter who was in Dealey Plaza delivering forged Secret Service credentials to participants in the assassination as a part of their cover-up. You can find Chauncey Holt's remarks to this effect even in Newsweek magazine. Sheriff J.E. Bill Decker. Sheriff Decker had the reputation for running Dallas County with an iron hand. He ordered his deputies not to participate in any way in protection for the presidential motorcade. However, he also directed one of his deputies, Harry Weatherford, who was an expert marksman, to position himself on the Dallas County Records Building with a high-powered rifle and a telescopic sight. When later Harry Weatherford was asked if he had anything to do with the assassination, he swore and said he killed lots of sons of bitches. That was the way he responded to the question. Chief Jesse Curry, Dallas Police Department. Chief Curry, who drove the vehicle that led JFK to his death in Dealey Plaza, claimed to have known immediately that 3 and only 3 shots had been fired, and that all 3 were fired from the school book depository, even though his car was under the triple underpass at the time, a location, one might have thought, that would make it very difficult for anyone to judge the number and location of shots fired. He subsequently appeared on Air Force One in time for the swearing in, and in that famous photograph of LBJ with his right hand raised, Jackie standing beside him in her blood-stained outfit, you can see Chief Curry's face partially obscured by LBJ's right hand. When Lee Oswald was transferred at the jail on Sunday morning, Chief Curry received a phone call from Mayor Cabell at precisely the time the transfer was taking place, which of course completely absolved him of any responsibility for what followed. Sergeant Gerald Hill, Dallas Police Department. Gerald Hill had an interesting day on the 22nd of November. Everywhere that Lee Harvey Oswald was, Gerald Hill was not far behind. He was at the site of the Tippit shooting. He was at the site of the Texas Theater where Oswald was arrested when 20 squad cars converged after a report that someone had entered a theater without paying a ticket. Surely one of the most remarkable responses in force to a minor infraction in the history of American law enforcement. Gerald Hill has also been implicated as participating in the cover-up in a serious study conducted using voice stress analysis that is reported in a book by George O'Toole entitled The Assassination Tapes, 1975. That's a very important book that also discredits testimony provided by Buell Wesley Frazier, who claimed that he drove Lee Harvey Oswald to work that day with curtain rods. Also discredits the testimony of Howard Brennan, who claimed to have seen the shooter in the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. Also discredits the testimony of Helen Markham, who claimed to have been across the street and to have seen Oswald shoot J.D. Tippit. Voice stress analysis suggests that all of their testimony was false and concocted, not worthy of belief. In addition, J. Gordon Shanklin of the FBI, he was the head of the FBI branch in Dallas, the agent in charge. He and Secret Service agent Forrest Sorrells, who was the head of the Secret Service branch in Dallas, I believe that the assassination could not have gone down without their being knowledgeable about the event at the time, and therefore they are on this list. Robert A. Frazier, FBI, gave truthful testimony about the location of the wounds in JFK's jacket and shirt, but he gave astonishing and incredible, literally incredible evidence about the nature of the rifle that Oswald was using. The rifle was in poor shape. It was literally a piece of junk. It was a part of a lot of junk weapons that could be bought at, a dozen for a couple of dollars. It had to be reconstructed before it could be fired by those who were seeking to test it afterwards. And while Frazier claims to have been an expert on firearms, it's most unlikely that he would have had any expertise with respect to firearms of this kind. The FBI, after all, deals with sidearms, small arms, .45 caliber automatics, machine guns, and the like, but it's most unlikely that Frazier would have had any knowledge about obscure World War II military rifles of the kind that Oswald is alleged to have used. His testimony, however, was that this was an excellent choice of weapon and very appropriate for an assassination, even though Lee Harvey Oswald did have some acquaintance with firearms and could have purchased a completely superior firearm on any corner store in Dallas without producing any identification. This is another reason, of course, to be suspicious about his purchase of the Mannlicher Carcano to assassinate the president. Commander James J. Humes, United States Navy; J. Thornton Boswell, United States Navy; John H. Ebersol, United States Navy. All three of them participated in the autopsy. Ebersol is the radiologist. Several of the technicians who were there that night suggested that Ebersol was actually directing the course of the autopsy, and that would have made excellent sense from the point of view of the technical aspects of conducting an autopsy, because the radiologist is the person responsible for taking the x-rays, and just as in the case of Blakey, the x-rays ordinarily constitute the strongest or the best evidence in a case. Were it not for David Mantick's ingenious experiments using optical densitometry, we might not know today that exactly how those x-rays had been fabricated. But given Mantick's evidence, there's every reason to believe that Humes and Boswell and Ebersol, who have misdescribed other aspects of the autopsy, including the time at which they learned of wounds to the president's throat, clearly belong on this list. John Stover, Calvin Galloway, George C. Berkeley, USN. Well, of course, they were commanding officers at the Naval Hospital and the president's personal physician. It's very interesting to observe that of all of the persons who were at Parkland on the airplane and at Bethesda, only a small group were in all three locations. That small group would have had to have knowledge that the description of the wounds at Parkland was very different from the description of the wounds at Bethesda, and that something was seriously amiss. Those persons include the president's personal physician, George Berkeley, and Secret Service agents William Greer and Roy Kellerman. Charles Cabell, United States Air Force. Charles Cabell was the deputy director of the CIA at the time of the Bay of Pigs. It was Charles Cabell who called John Kennedy at about 4:30 in the morning to plead with him for close air support, which Jack refused to provide. It was Charles Cabell who, when he was dismissed from the CIA, along with Allen Dulles and Richard Bissell, returned to the Pentagon describing Jack Kennedy as a traitor. Charles Cabell was born in Dallas, Texas in 1903. The mayor of Dallas in 1963 was his brother Earl Cabell, born in Dallas in 1906. If one is interested in solving a crime by looking for motive, means, and opportunity, then I submit that the Cabell connection is the key, because Charles Cabell had been the person overseeing the efforts of the CIA in collusion with the mob to assassinate Fidel Castro. He had participated in the training of those assassination teams. He believed that Jack Kennedy was a traitor to his country. He had both the motive and the means, and it's very plausible to conclude, as I believe, that his brother Earl provided him with the opportunity. You must recall that the mayor of a city such as Dallas not only has responsibility for supervising the police department, as indeed was the case here, but also was responsible for parade routes and other ceremonial activities. This motorcade could never have taken the improper route it did without approval and concurrence from the mayor of the city of Dallas. Mr. Henry Wade. Mr. Henry Wade was the district attorney for Dallas, Texas. He concluded with remarkable speed, even before any serious investigation had begun, that Lee Harvey Oswald was guilty, that he had done it beyond reasonable doubt and to a moral certainty. He went on national television and said as much. His views were reported all over the country and had a great deal to do with convincing people in the public mind that Oswald was guilty as he had been charged. Mr. Clint Murchison, Mr. H.L. Hunt, Mr. D.H. Byrd. These are all rather prominent Texas oil millionaires. Murchison and Hunt, of course, far more familiar than Byrd. Byrd, however, had a long-time ownership of the Texas School Book Depository building since around 1938. The building itself has a very curious history. A fine article on this subject was recently published in the third decade, a journal that is devoted to assassination research. I think anyone who wants to complete their understanding of the physical facilities at Dealey Plaza cannot afford to overlook this study of the ownership of the Texas School Book Depository building. Apparently all the employees at the time, incidentally, were paid strictly in cash, so that if records were produced of Oswald's payments as an employee, they had to be fabricated after the fact. Mr. Allen Dulles, Mr. Arlen Specter, Mr. David Bellin. These were all principals in the conduct of the Warren Commission. Allen Dulles, of course, had a very strong hand in the course that the Warren Commission took and in fashioning its ultimate report. Mr. Arlen Specter was a junior counsel to the Warren Commission whose responsibility was accounting for all the wounds and who fabricated, who introduced, who conceived of the magic bullet theory, the idea that one bullet had caused all these wounds. There's a lot of evidence of inadequate investigation by the staff. It's interesting to observe that most of the investigation conducted by the Warren Commission was left to the FBI, and only some of it was conducted by the Warren Commission staff itself, which was composed principally of lawyers. Lawyers, as those who are familiar with the television series Law and Order are no doubt aware, have the role of preparing prosecution briefs in order to bring evidence to bear at trial against an accused. They are not generally involved in investigating crimes themselves. That is left to the police and other investigative agencies. In the case of the assassination, it was left to J. Edgar Hoover and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mr. David Bellin was a high-level counsel to the Warren Commission and has spent a tremendous amount of time in public and in private in praising the work of the Warren Commission and in seeking to rebut the views of their critics, casting much aspersion upon their character and motivation. It seems to me that David Bellin appropriately belongs on this list given the new discoveries we have about the nature of the evidence and the incredibly slipshod and sloppy way in which the investigation was conducted. Gerald Ford. I do not for a moment believe that Gerald Ford would have had anything to do with a conspiracy to assassinate the President of the United States had he had any knowledge of any such event. However, Gerald Ford was widely reported to be the FBI's man on the Warren Commission and to have provided constant feedback to J. Edgar Hoover about the direction that the Warren Commission was taking in its investigation. And for that reason, his name is on this list. J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover may have had the most remarkable career in American government as the dominant figure of an important investigative institution, but there is massive evidence that he abused his position and perverted his responsibilities. Anyone who's interested in learning about J. Edgar Hoover should study a new book by Anthony Summers, published in 1993, entitled Official and Confidential, which not only reports the acrimonious relations he had with the Kennedys and his desire not to be retired, but also reflects on FBI performance in the case of investigating the assassination. A nice illustration is that of Regis Kennedy, who was an FBI agent on loan from New Orleans. During the week after the assassination, Regis Kennedy visited Beverly Oliver, who has been known and often referred to as the babushka lady because individuals knew how she was dressed but did not know her identity. Beverly Oliver, it turns out, was a stripper who worked at a club near Jack Ruby's Carousel Club. She was standing very close to Mary Moorman and Jean Hill at the time of the assassination and took a motion picture of the assassination, which, were it available, would probably provide some of the most informative visual evidence of all of the assassination because she was filming from that side of the entire grassy knoll and therefore could have provided extremely important evidence about shooters firing from the grassy knoll. Regis Kennedy visited her and asked if he could take her film for use as evidence and promised that he would return it within 10 days. He took the film, but it was never returned. No one knows what has become of it. Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson may have been the most ruthless and ambitious figure in American political history. He always wanted to be the president of all the people, and yet that possibility appeared to be slipping from his grasp. The Bobby Baker scandal, to which I have alluded, was a very strong indication that he was in deep political trouble. I already showed you the Life magazine for the 8th of November, but on the Life magazine for 22 November, there was another major story on the scandal growing in Washington that was going to strongly affect his reputation in Washington and his prospects for running again with JFK. There was to be a vote in the United States Senate on Friday afternoon, a vote about Bobby Baker that would have had lasting repercussions for LBJ. When the assassination took place, however, the vote was canceled, and it never took place. Madeline Brown, his mistress, by whom he had a son who lived to be a teenager, came forth about 18 months ago to report that Lyndon had told her shortly before the assassination that after Friday he wasn't going to have to put up with embarrassment from those Kennedy boys any longer. And when she asked him if he knew who were involved, he replied that he did, that the CIA and the oil boys had decided he had to be taken out. LBJ's biographer, Doris Kearns Goodwin, has said of LBJ, there is nothing he would stop at to get what he wants. And there appears to be a great deal of corroborating evidence for that claim. Anyone who has an interest in LBJ's motives and behavior about this time might want to take a look at a recent book by Craig Zerbel entitled The Texas Connection, published in 1991. I don't want to suggest that everyone who had anything to do with the assassination was necessarily a bad guy. Here are some special cases. Alone among the Secret Service agents who participated in the motorcade, Clint Hill took some action to assist. It has been observed by Mike Pincher of Palmdale, California, that Clint Hill's motives may have had to do with Jackie rather than with Jack. The only reason Clint Hill was on that motorcade was because he was Jackie's personal bodyguard, and she specifically had asked him to participate in the motorcade. Moreover, if you think about the sequence of events and when Clint Hill began to respond, it appears fairly obvious that it was only when Jackie started to climb back over the limousine that Clint Hill ran forward to assist apparently her rather than the president. Nevertheless, alone among the Secret Service agents, he made some efforts to act in an appropriate fashion. Gerald F. Custer, Paul O'Connor, James Curtis Jenkins, Floyd Reeby, Dennis David. These were all military technicians or administrators in the United States Navy who were stationed at Bethesda Hospital at the time of the autopsy. They have all repeatedly, publicly protested that the x-rays and photographs from the autopsy are fabrications, are fake, and cannot be believed. These are individuals who were physically present at the time, and yet they have not been taken seriously. The nation's press and the nation's politicians has all but ignored what they have had to say. It seems to me that their conduct here has been very courageous in coming forth and stating what not only appears to be true, but which has now been positively corroborated by the medical findings of David Mantic. Charles Crenshaw, MD. While many of the other physicians also testified to the nature of the wounds in ways that corroborated Crenshaw's description, he nevertheless has been particularly outspoken and forthright in addressing what has happened. He recently published a book, JFK Conspiracy of Silence, in which he reported the circumstances that prevailed at the time and his experiences not only in treating the President of the United States, but 2 days later, Lee Harvey Oswald, his accused assassin. I suggest that this book is very worthwhile reading for anyone who wants to understand the perspective of the physicians who participated in the President's treatment at Parkland Hospital. I think it's a notable contribution and does a great deal to illuminate what happened in this case. Jean Hill was a witness at Dealey Plaza who was standing beside Mary Moorman when she was taking her photographs. Mary Moorman had a Polaroid camera that required processing the film as it came from the camera in order to be developed, so she could only take a shot about every 10 seconds, and Jean was assisting her in doing that. Immediately after the assassination, she rushed up onto the grassy knoll and reports that she was shortly thereafter apprehended by individuals who indicated that they had been observing her, who relieved her of several photographs that Mary Moorman had taken, and who subsequently interrogated her for a substantial period of time. When she told them that she thought she had heard several shots, including some fired from the grassy knoll, they told her that that couldn't possibly be right because only 3 shots had been fired and they'd all come from the Texas School Book Depository building. They told her she shouldn't talk about what she heard. At the time, she was dating a member of the Dallas Police Department, and when she told him of her experiences, he advised her that she ought to keep her mouth shut, which Jean Hill proceeded to do. For approximately 25, 26 years, she kept her mouth shut until finally she came forth and published a book entitled Jean Hill, the Last Dissenting Witness, that described her experiences in Dealey Plaza. I think if you want to know what it was like to be a witness to that event on that tragic day, you could not do much better than read that book. Problem cases. Malcolm Perry, MD. I believe that Malcolm Perry was a red-blooded all-American boy who had a very promising career ahead of him, that he was an extremely competent and proficient general surgeon, and that he gave President Kennedy the highest quality care that he could possibly have provided under the circumstances. I believe that Malcolm Perry wanted to testify truthfully and completely about the events that occurred at Parkland Hospital, but that circumstances conspired against him. I remind you of the testimony of Aubrey Bell, the nurse, who said that the following morning when he came in, she had never seen anyone who appeared to be so dejected, that he had been kept up all night by phone calls from Bethesda Hospital trying to convince him that he should change his description of the throat wound from an entrance wound to a wound of exit. Later, of course, during his Warren Commission appearance, our inspector made it possible to obscure, better than change, to obscure the importance of his testimony by a series of hypothetical questions that allowed him to concede that if you granted those assumptions, then you'd have to grant the conclusion that the wound was a wound of exit. Moreover, his important testimony at Parkland Hospital was never before the Warren Commission, precisely because of the claim that there was over 200 hours of tape to classify, and they'd never got around to it, notwithstanding the fact that this would have been the very first element, the very first story covered on all that tape. Pierre Fink, MD. Pierre Fink subsequently testified about several aspects of the autopsy and the assassination that were considerably important and contrary to the government's official position. He was subpoenaed to testify during the Jim Garrison inquiry, and among the assertions he made at that time was that there were high-ranking officers who appeared to be directing the autopsy. This directly contradicts the claim of Commander Humes that he and he alone was in charge of the autopsy, but it appears as though Fink's testimony is accurate and Commander Humes is not. George Lundberg, MD, was the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Medical Association when it began publishing a series of biased and one-sided articles on the assassination. These articles were completely uncritical reports based upon interviews with Humes and Boswell, perhaps the two individuals who had the greatest stake in providing evidence in support of their official autopsy report and the Warren Commission's study of the investigation. These articles were not properly reviewed by anyone who possessed suitable knowledge of the assassination. At a symposium on the assassination that was held in Chicago, George Lundberg conceded that he knew practically nothing about the assassination and that his only interest in the assassination was in the role of a journalist. This is quite astonishing given the amount of attention and promotion that George Lundberg gave to these articles, including a national press conference that he presented standing behind an AMA podium, conveying the impression that the American Medical Association endorsed these findings, which could not be further from the truth. In my estimation, these articles were very carefully timed in order to counteract the tremendous surge of interest in the assassination that had been stimulated by Oliver Stone's film JFK. It seems to me that his abuse of the journal was reprehensible and completely unprofessional, and I make this assertion as the editor of one journal and co-editor of another. If the reconstruction of the assassination that is supported by the evidence that I have been reviewing with you is even remotely right-headed, then it may be largely explanatory as to why it has been so difficult to unearth the truth in this case. The conspirators may have been emboldened by the fact, the evident consideration, that they were largely in control of all of the legal and investigative agencies to which this crime might appropriately be reported. Consider the following chart. If someone wanted to report any evidence about this crime, they might, of course, have thought of turning to the Dallas Police Department, but its chief, of course, was Jesse Curry. Alternatively, they might have thought of turning to the Dallas County Sheriff's Department, but it was headed by J.E. Bill Decker, Sheriff. The only other local recourse presumably would be the Dallas District Attorney's Office, but that was headed by Henry Wade, District Attorney. Thus, anyone living in the locale where the crime had been committed who wanted to report any information or evidence they had about the crime would have been in a very awkward position to do so, given what we, at this point, understand about the crime. An investigation was taken up by the Texas State Attorney General by the name of Wagoner Carr. who made a report to the Warren Commission that led to a secret meeting on the 22nd of January 1964. What Waggoner Carr had discovered was reports that Lee Harvey Oswald was an undercover agent for the FBI, that he had undercover agent number 179, that he was being paid $200 a month since 1962 and was still under contract with the FBI at the time of the assassination. This led to great concern among the members of the commission who had Waggoner Carr come to Washington secretly and discuss it with them, and they concluded that his report was so serious that it needed to be pursued, but in fact nothing was ever done to follow up on what he had to say. You can find a useful discussion of this, incidentally, in Mark Lane's valuable book, Rush to Judgment, which was published already in 1966. If one had sought to bring evidence of this crime to agencies outside of Texas, then the most appropriate would have been the Federal Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover, Director, the Department of Justice, Bobby Kennedy, Attorney General, or the White House, Lyndon B. Johnson, President. The most interesting possibility, obviously, was the Department of Justice, but I think that circumstances suggest Bobby Kennedy was boxed in by a superior at the White House and by a subordinate at the FBI. Remember, Lyndon Johnson created the Warren Commission not only to head off other investigations at the local and state level, but also to preempt investigations other than through the Bureau of Investigation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Moreover, it's stunning that a memorandum that was distributed already on the 25th of November 1963 by Bobby Kennedy's deputy, Nicholas Katzenbach, to Bill Moyers, who was Lyndon Baines Johnson's press secretary, lays out instructions for covering the assassination. Anyone who wants to know why the American people suspect that there's been a cover-up of the assassination at the highest level must study this memorandum, the text of which reads as follows. It is important that all the facts surrounding President Kennedy's assassination be made public in a way which will satisfy people in the United States and abroad that all the facts have been told, and that a statement to this effect be made now. Number one, the public must be satisfied that Oswald was the assassin, that he did not have Confederates who are still at large, and that the evidence was such that he would have been convicted at trial. Remember now, this is a memorandum being written on Monday the 25th. Oswald had only been assassinated Sunday the 24th. The assassination had only taken place Friday the 22nd, 3 days before. And nevertheless, the conclusion is being drawn in the form of a directive about how the assassination should be covered, that the public must be satisfied that Oswald was the assassin, that he did not have Confederates who are still at large, and that the evidence was such that he would have been convicted at a trial. There's no possible way that those conclusions could have been known to be true at this point in time. Therefore, you have at the highest level taking for granted a conclusion that was in fact yet to be established by any serious inquiry. Number two, speculation about Oswald's motivation ought to be cut off, and we should have some basis for rebutting thought that this was a communist conspiracy, or, as the Iron Curtain Press is saying, a right-wing conspiracy to blame it on the communists. Unfortunately, the facts on Oswald seem too pat, too obvious, Marxist, Cuba, Russian wife, etc. The Dallas police have put out statements on the communist conspiracy theory, and it was they who were in charge when he was shot and thus silenced. Fascinating. Think about it. Fascinating. And indeed, this communist angle was very much played up by the press in Dallas, Texas at the time. Shortly after the assassination, for example, broadcasters were reporting that a communist had killed Kennedy because he wasn't turning the country communist fast enough. Fascinating. Number three, the matter has been handled thus far with neither dignity nor conviction. Facts have been mixed with rumor and speculation. We can scarcely let the world see us totally in the image of the Dallas police when our president is murdered. I think this objective may be satisfied by making public as soon as possible a complete and thorough FBI report on Oswald and the assassination. This may run into the difficulty of pointing to inconsistencies between this report and statements by Dallas police officials, but the reputation of the Bureau is such that it may do the whole job. That's from Nicholas Katzenbach, Deputy Attorney General of the United States, to Bill Moyers, White House Press Secretary, on 25 November 1963. If anyone is interested in evidence of cover-up by the federal government, in the assassination of John Kennedy, they cannot do better than start with this document. If Bobby was boxed in at the Justice Department, and if his deputy was preempting the idea of any serious inquiry, if all the investigation was left in the hands of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, then where else could one turn? Here are three possibilities. The CIA. How about the Secret Service? Or, alternatively, the Warren Commission. I might observe that after the Warren Commission was disbanded, no branch of the government officially had responsibility for conducting investigation of the assassination. If anyone wants a serious chronicle of the repeated failure of the Department of Justice of the United States to pursue leads, even those provided by the government itself in the form of the House Select Committee on Investigations, you cannot do better than read the book by Anthony Summers, Conspiracy, published in 1980. Well, that was then, this is now. One might imagine that having discovered new evidence of a cover-up and conspiracy in the assassination, that our group might want to bring this to the attention of the federal government. I have made repeated efforts to do so. Already on 17 September 1993, I wrote to the Honorable Janet Reno, Attorney General of the United States, providing her with a summary of new evidence in this case related to the testimony of Robert B. Livingston. Here is a copy of the letter that I sent to Attorney General Reno. I'll read you the first paragraph. Dear Madam Attorney General, this letter brings to your attention a witness whose testimony appears to provide conclusive evidence that James Humes, one of the medical officers who performed the autopsy on John F. Kennedy at Bethesda Naval Hospital, had knowledge of the existence of a wound to the throat and of its importance as evidence of a shot fired from the front and therefore of a second gunman on Friday the 22nd prior to conducting the autopsy, even though he has claimed that he only learned of a wound to the throat the following day, Saturday the 23rd, after the autopsy was over. I continue to describe this evidence on the rest of that page and the next and explain its importance. On page 3, you will observe I emphasize, if Dr. Livingston's testimony concerning his conversation with Humes on the 22nd is accurate, then it provides strong evidence for these conclusions. Number 1, that Humes, Boswell, and Perry lied under oath, etc. Number 2, that government officials promoted a cover-up. And number 3, that the single bullet theory is almost certainly false. Even more significantly, an entry wound to the neck also destroys the single assassin scenario. I sent a subsequent letter to the Attorney General on the 27th of September 1993, I show it here, regarding new evidence, including, among other items, the full transcript of the Parkland press conference, just in case the Department of Justice might have misplaced it or not be able to get a hold of it. I received a response from the Department of Justice, which I show you here, dated December 7th, 1993. This letter was not from the Attorney General, but rather from Mary C. Spearing, Chief, General Litigation and Legal Advice Section. I read you a couple of selections from her letter. Your 2 recent letters to the Attorney General regarding the assassination of President John F. Kennedy were referred to the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice for response. Next paragraph, as you are probably aware, in 1978, the United States House of Representatives Select Committee on Assassinations issued a detailed report regarding President Kennedy's assassination. End of that paragraph. Those congressional publications provided detailed analysis of the autopsy findings and addressed many of the issues which you have raised regarding the assassination of President Kennedy. Next page. We appreciate your efforts in contacting the Department of Justice regarding this matter of mutual concern. Well, I was profoundly disturbed by this response because I was bringing to their attention the testimony of the highest-ranking scientist in both the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations, a man who had actually telephoned Commander Humes on the day of the assassination, a person of impeccable integrity and whose testimony had never been heard by any government agency investigating the assassination. Therefore, it was incredible to me how I could be told by Mary Spearing that the House Select Committee's inquiry had covered the issues that were being raised in Robert Livingston's testimony. Moreover, given the findings of David Mantic, I wrote yet a second series of letters, the first of which was mailed to the Attorney General on the 14th of December 1993. I headed Fabricated Evidence in the Assassination of JFK, and I refer to the letter from Mary Spearing to me of 7 December. Most important, highlighted in the second paragraph of this brief letter, I would observe that the information under consideration here concerns the fabrication of x-rays and of other evidence in this case, which goes far beyond the scope of the HSCA investigation, I would be grateful to receive a response more appropriate than that of reference A. Then again, on 18 December, I wrote a letter directly to Mary Spearing. I said, "Dear Ms. Spearing, this letter is written to lodge a complaint about your casual and dismissive response in reference A to information that I sent to the Attorney General via references B and C. On the second page, I point out, I was not expressing concern, but providing evidence, which appears to be conclusive, that Humes et al. Have made false statements to the Warren Commission and the House Committee. I also observe I was not merely endorsing certain theories about the assassination, the official account being only the most inadequate, but actually submitting some very important evidence." I concluded on page 3 making several important points. Dr. Mantic visited the National Archives 4 times during October and repeatedly examined the x-rays of President Kennedy's skull and body that are preserved there. As you may discern from reading Enclosure 3 and Appendix G, he has discovered that the x-rays are fabrications and that the HSCA single bullet theory is wrong. I therefore hope that you do not plan to respond to reference D by referring again to the HSCA report, which has been discredited by Dr. Mantic's objective and repeatable scientific findings. In the final paragraph, I would also observe that other evidence provided by reference D deserves serious consideration, including, for example, Dr. Livingston's conclusion that the diagrams and photographs in the National Archives that purport to be of the brain of John F. Kennedy must be of someone else's brain. It does not take a rocket scientist to appreciate that the opinion of a world authority on the human brain in a case of this kind must be taken seriously. I therefore hope that you will not again trivialize the importance of what I am submitting. I am not alone in believing that the Department of Justice has neither the talent nor the inclination to examine this case objectively. I therefore urge the appointment of a special prosecutor to pursue this case. I sent copies of this letter to Joanne Harris, Assistant Attorney General, Louis B. Free, Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Honorable Janet Reno, Attorney General, the Honorable Al Gore, U.S. Vice President, and the Honorable Bill Clinton, U.S. President. On the 25th of January, 1994, I received yet another letter from Mary Spearing, in which she claims on the second paragraph, "While the report of the House Select Committee on Assassinations was prepared prior to your allegations, as you noted, it does in fact address many of the issues which you have recently raised." Incredible. She also states, "While we would be pleased to continue to review any new evidence," in quotes, "or opinions which you refer to the department, we regret that in the interest of conservation of scarce resources, we will be unable to reply to your letters in the future." How thoughtful. Final sentence. "We appreciate your interest in the assassination and your willingness to advise the Department of Justice of your views." Signed, Mary Spearing, Chief, General Litigation and Legal Advice Section. I was not happy with that reply. Under the circumstances, I thought it was hopelessly inadequate, so I wrote once again directly to Mary Spearing in a letter dated 30 January 1994. "Dear Ms. Spearing, in reference A, you indicate that the new evidence I provided by my earlier correspondence had been dealt with by the HSCA inquiry and other investigations. Since I was reporting to you the results of studies of the X-rays conducted in October 1993, employing a scientific technique known as optical densitometry, which had never before been employed for this purpose, your response is not only logically absurd, but scientifically illiterate. I understand that you passed my submissions past 3 attorneys knowledgeable about the assassination, but unless they possess the relevant scientific qualifications to appraise Dr. Mantic's studies, by virtue of possessing a PhD physics and an MD with a specialty in radiology, for example, their opinion is completely irrelevant. This is a scientific question about a matter of fact and not a legal question that could be answered by a set of attorneys. I have no interest in embarrassing you personally or the Department of Justice, but I want you to know that this story is gradually making its way into the public domain. Take 10 minutes of your time and read the article in reference B, which is enclosed. It will be time well spent. If you ever involve yourself personally in a case rather than supervise those who deal with them, this is the time. You must come to grips with this development." I was very disheartened by the response of the Department of Justice, and has further convinced me that the only possible way that we can get to the heart of the matter in the assassination of JFK is by the appointment of a special prosecutor independent of the Department of Justice itself.